I'm Peggy Scott Laborde, and welcome to New Orleans Pieces of the Past. We're taking a look at local history through photos from my collection and area archives. Pontchartrain Beach, the historic Southern Railway Station, the St. Charles Hotel, Mark Twain, Lafcadio Hearn, and Louis Armstrong. Just part of the list of New Orleans places and people that we'll recall during the next half hour. For over a century and a half, at the corner of St. Charles and Common Streets in the Central Business District stood at different times 3 buildings named the St. Charles Hotel. The first 2, regarded as the finest hotels in the city, were lost to fire. In 1896, a third one opened and garnered a similar reputation as a fine hotel. It was designed by renowned architect Thomas Sully. It had lavish public spaces. The lobby boasted Corinthian columns and an elaborate staircase. Here's a photo at Christmas time. In 1946, author Lyle Saxon actually resided at the St. Charles. After World War II, he gave a live national radio broadcast on Mardi Gras Day from the hotel. Business offices were located within the St. Charles, including a branch of the Western Union Telegram Service. WNOE Radio had its studios within the hotel. A then budding musician named Elvis Presley did an interview at the station in 1956. The hotel featured a restaurant and a lounge named the Outrigger. By 1959, it was known as the Sheraton Charles Hotel. And in 1967, the movie version of the popular novel called Hotel by Arthur Haley was filmed using the St. Charles as a setting. I actually recall going to a high school prom in one of the ballrooms. Sadly, the hotel was torn down in 1974. A decade went by, and the Place St. Charles office building was constructed. No longer a location for lodging, this downtown corner is still a setting with lots of activity. Among local buildings that I wish were still with us was the Southern Railway Terminal, also known as New Orleans Terminal. It was built in 1908 on the Basin Street median at the intersection of downtown Canal Street. Designed by famed architect Daniel Burnham, who also planned Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, this terminal served numerous railway lines, notably Southern. It was the terminus for the Southerner, which linked our city to the Northeast, with New York as its final destination. And there were waiting areas that were spacious and even included a restaurant. A distinctive semicircular window graced the station's facade. At one point, instead of newspapers, some newsboys handed out what were known of as Blue Books, a directory of local houses of ill repute in Storyville, which was located across the street from the station. The red light district was shut down by 1917. Sadly, the railway station was demolished in 1956, when all passenger service was relocated to the new Union passenger terminal nearby. One of New Orleans' lost landmarks was located on the edge of Uptown, the original main branch of the New Orleans Public Library. Facing Lee Circle, it was built in 1907 through the generosity of philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. He paid for the construction of public libraries nationwide.
Oh, I was so sorry when that building was torn down. I mean, there's so much to weep for, and that's one of the things that I weep for is that building. It was great. There was it was grass outside. You know, part of it was built up. You had to walk up steps to go in it, and you could sit out on that grass and read too. And we would skip the children's department altogether. We would go upstairs, and there was an enormous reading room with great big windows where you could take books out of the stack and you could come and find a table and sit there and read without ever checking the book out.
Those visits to the library inspired a passion that resulted in her life's work.
We would go back in the stacks, and the stacks had green glass floors. And I would just sit down on the floor and go through book after book, you know. And I remember reading a lot in that library. I read horror stories, English horror tales, which later very much influenced my writing. We checked out a lot of books, and I was often painfully overdue. I'd go in there and I'd give these long excuses about what happened and so forth. And I think I was able to strike some bargains. And every now and then they'd say, "You don't belong up here, you belong in the children's section." So we'd get banished to the children's section for a little while, but then we'd get back upstairs, you know.
The library, considered too small, was demolished in 1959. Today, K&B Plaza occupies the site. We are blessed to still have streetcars today. Back then, there were almost a dozen lines in operation, as you can see from the activity on Canal Street. Notice the turn of some of the tracks. Those were for trolleys whose route included the French Quarter. The Desire streetcar line went down Bourbon Street to the Bywater neighborhood and eventually back to Canal up Royal. It was discontinued May 30th, 1948. Ironically, Tennessee Williams's Pulitzer Prize-winning play, A Streetcar Named Desire, made its debut a little over 6 months before. The Canal Street Ferry, which crossed the Mississippi to get to Algiers, included space for cars. Alas, in 2013, vehicle service was eliminated in favor of carrying passengers only. Parking was once available in front of Jackson Square. That changed in the 1970s when the city adopted an outdoor mall concept. And even though we're used to seeing mule-drawn buggies in the Quarter these days, this one was likely used to sell produce to residents in nearby neighborhoods. There's no doubt that New Orleans has a colorful past, but there's one color that stirs memories of a gone but not forgotten drugstore, and that's purple. New Orleanians even had a name for the distinctive hue, known locally as K&B Purple. The purple packaging of K&B drugs that proved to be advertising genius started as a stroke of luck. When another local merchant ordered but then declined delivery of a load of purple paper, K&B bought the paper at a considerable discount. The rest was history. There would be no mistaking where a shopper had been when they were seen carrying those distinctive purple packages. Gustav Katz was established in New Orleans as a trusted pharmacist when he befriended Sidney Bestoff, a successful drugstore owner from Memphis. The two men became business partners, opening the first Katz and Bestoff drugstore in 1905. In a short time, K&B drugstores sprang up throughout New Orleans. Besides over-the-counter medications and prescriptions, the stores featured a potpourri of inventory, beauty products and gardening supplies, to name a few. The chain also launched products under its name, and the drugstores were a popular source for K&B brand liquor, as well as its ice cream. In 1997, Rite Aid bought the K&B chain, which had grown to 186 stores in the Gulf South, Texas, and Tennessee. The beloved drugstores are gone, but you can still see purple every Mardi Gras, right there besides Carnival's signature green and gold. While most attractions along the midway of New Orleans' Pontchartrain Beach were rides or games of skill, during the 1940s and into the 1960s, there was the Cockeyed Circus, and right next door, Laugh in the Dark. These were walk-through attractions. Cockeyed was an apt description, since there was a mirror maze, which certainly made you feel askew. I also recall jets of air coming from below the floor, which of course wreaked havoc with skirts and elicited more than a few screams of surprise. Carrying forth the circus theme was a giant head of a clown, which quickly became the meeting spot for beachgoers. According to a recollection from Frank Jones in the book Pontchartrain Beach, A Family Affair by Brian Batt and Katie Danos, Jones's stepfather, Alfred Willis, constructed the clown head's wood framework. Beach owner and Brian's grandfather, Harry Batt Sr., brought in a sculptor from Paris to create with plaster the iconic face. In addition to his carpentry skills, Willis was also the captain of the beach's lifeguards. The clown photo was taken by photographer Joe Buddy Jr. He was a cameraman at WDSU-TV for almost 40 years, starting when the station was founded in 1948. I got to know this kind, gentle man a few years before he retired. Sensing a shared fondness for New Orleans history, he gave me the photo, which recalls a fun-filled summer for many. In 1877, Greek-born writer Lafcadio Hearn moved from Cincinnati to New Orleans, quickly embracing what he considered a more laid-back, almost Caribbean culture. A quote from Hearn, "I'd rather live in New Orleans in sackcloth and ashes than to own the state of Ohio." Initially freelancing for a Cincinnati paper, he soon found work with the New Orleans Daily City Item and later the Times-Democrat. While writing for the item, he also created and published 200 woodcuts of everyday life. Unfortunately, after 6 months, he had to give up doing the woodcuts, which proved to be too much of a strain on his eyesight, having lost vision in one eye during a schoolyard skirmish. In addition to casting a spotlight on corruption in local government, Hearn also wrote about New Orleans people and places, rituals, including carnival, and even voodoo. Hearn served as an informal ambassador, raising the city's profile through his stories for such national publications as Harper's Weekly and Scribner's Magazine. From his local experiences came books, Gumbo Zerbe, Little Dictionary of Creole Proverbs, and La Cuisine Creole, a collection of recipes from local housewives and chefs. That book helped introduce Creole cooking to a wider audience. Hearn also wrote Cheetah, A Memory of Last Island, a novella based on the devastating hurricane of 1856. In 1887, Hearn moved to Martinique as the French West Indies correspondent for Harper's Weekly. 2 years later, he moved to Japan, where he married and became a Japanese citizen. But his decade-long stay in New Orleans was time well spent for him and for us. She wanted to leave Italy and go east to the Orient, but Pope Leo XIII urged her to go west to America, where so many of her countrymen were poverty-stricken and needed assistance. Mother Frances Xavier Cabrini founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart, arriving in New York City in 1889. 3 years later, she and her nuns came to New Orleans to tend the needs of local Italian, mostly Sicilian immigrants. The sisters occupied a large building on St. Philip Street in the French Quarter and opened a school and later a day nursery. But the priority was to start an orphanage, since many children had lost their parents due to yellow fever outbreaks. Outgrowing their French Quarter facility, Mother Cabrini secured a donation of $75,000 from Captain and Mrs. Salvatore Pizzotti. With those funds, in 1905, Cabrini was able to build an orphanage on Esplanade Avenue. On view in the building is her bedroom, as well as many personal items, along with her checkbook. She died in 1917. But her missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart continued their work in New Orleans. By 1959, the orphanage was converted into a Catholic girls' high school. 6 years later, a modern structure was built on Bayou St. John, behind the original building. Mother Cabrini became a naturalized citizen and is America's first saint. But because of her local legacy, she is considered the original New Orleans saint. William Faulkner called him the father of American literature. Mark Twain, whose actual name was Samuel Longhorn Clemens, visited New Orleans first while training to be a steamboat pilot in 1859. He was 23. He disembarked from his vessel, the SS Alex Scott, and was mesmerized by what he saw. It turned out to be March the 8th. In a letter that he wrote to his sister Pamela, he describes his experience.
I saw 100 men, women, and children in fine, fancy, splendid, ugly, coarse, ridiculous, grotesque, laughable costumes. And the truth flashed upon me. This is Mardi Gras. It was Mardi Gras.
Twain goes into detail concerning the spectacle.
The streets were soon full of Mardi Gras, representing giants, Indians, monks, priests, clowns, birds, beasts, everything in fact that one could imagine. The free and easy women turned out en masse, and their costumes and actions were very trying to modest eyes.
He concludes his letter with,
Certainly, New Orleans seldom does things by halves.
almost a quarter of a century later, in April 1882, Twain was back in New Orleans. Now well established as a popular writer, he was traveling along the river again to gather material for his memoir, Life on the Mississippi. In his recollections, it wasn't just Mardi Gras that left an impression this time.
New Orleans food is as delicious as the less criminal forms of sin.
By the 1920s, the French Quarter was considered a run-down neighborhood, but still full of charm. The rent, inexpensive. New Orleans had gained a reputation as an exotic setting, a place where you could be yourself, a muse for writers. A recent transplant, Sherwood Anderson, was enjoying the success of his novel Winesburg, Ohio. He beckoned budding authors to the city. In 1924, he and his wife moved into 540B St. Peter Street, one of the historic Pentaba apartments. They welcomed such literary luminaries as William Faulkner, Carl Sandburg, Thomas Wolfe, and Lyle Saxon, who would go on to write local history books and serve as the editor for the Works Progress Administration's Guide to New Orleans, produced by the Federal Writers Project. Faulkner and the Andersons were especially close. The young writer actually stayed with the couple when he first came to the city. He was working on his first novel, Soldier's Pay. While in New Orleans, he wrote prose sketches that appeared in the Times-Picayune and The Double Dealer, a short-lived but influential local literary magazine that included the works of Ernest Hemingway and Robert Penn Warren. In March of 1925, Faulkner moved into an apartment at 624 Pirates Alley with Anderson's friend, artist William Spratling. Today, it's the home of Faulkner House Books. He and Spratling published a short book of quips and illustrations of some of their creative friends. Satirical and with a bit of a bite, it was called Sherwood Anderson and Other Famous Creoles. A few years later, Faulkner wrote a novel called Mosquitoes, drawing from his New Orleans experiences. The plot is based on a yacht cruise he took with Anderson and friends on Lake Pontchartrain. As it turns out, a young Lillian Hellman, who had grown up partially in New Orleans, recommended the novel to New York publisher Horace Livewright. Faulkner spent a total of 6 months in New Orleans. Yet another work, Pylon, was also inspired by his time in the city. Before he arrived, he was primarily a poet. After he left, he was on his way to becoming a Nobel Prize-winning novelist and the author of more than 30 books. Indeed, William Faulkner was just one of many writers inspired by a muse named New Orleans. Jazz great Louis Armstrong spent his first 21 years in New Orleans. Fortunately, he met some people along the way who became mentors. Growing up in poverty with his mother Mayanne and sister Beatrice, little Louis had a variety of jobs, including working for the Konofsky family, who helped him purchase a cornet. As a child, his neighborhood included South Rampart Street, where he and friends sang on the street for a change.
My Brazilian beauty, that was an early tune on the Amazon. That's where my lover's gone, gone, gone.
He ended up being arrested on New Year's Eve, 1912, for shooting off a gun. He was sent to what was known of as the Colored Waifs Home. Music teacher Peter Davis put together a band there and gave lessons. Louis eventually became the group's leader. Jazz funerals and parades put on by local social aid and pleasure clubs were a common sight in the 1910s. Louis got to know local band leader Joe King Oliver, a cornet and trumpet player, who took the now teenager under his wing. Armstrong began playing around town and caught the ear of pianist Faith Marable, who hired musicians for the Streckfus line of Mississippi riverboats that featured jazz. It was during his time on the riverboats that Louis learned how to read music. It was also a chance to travel beyond New Orleans. In 1922, he received a telegram from King Oliver, who had moved to Chicago a few years earlier to play at the Lincoln Gardens Dance Hall and Nightclub. Oliver had a job for his protege. With his suitcase, music instrument, and a fish sandwich from his mom, Louis boarded a train. And of course, the rest is American music history. Theodore Lilienthal was one of the city's most successful 19th century New Orleans photographers. He sold carte de visites, a 2.5 by 4-inch photo that was used as a memento or calling card. These photos were popular internationally from the 1860s until the 1880s. Many American photographers sold carte de visites of then famous people. This is Civil War General Benjamin Butler, who was in charge of New Orleans during the Union occupation. And here's the Grand Duke Alexis of Russia, who was a royal guest at the 1872 Mardi Gras in time for the first Rex Parade. By the 1880s, the larger cabinet card had gained more of a following. It was designed to be displayed on your cabinet. What a wonderful way to get a glimpse of 19th century Orleanians. The cabinet cards were 4¼ inches by 6½ inches and usually included the name of the photographic studio. Just as today, these were taken for special occasions, the birth of a baby. First Communion was especially popular then. This is my paternal grandmother, Leona Smith Scott. And of course, weddings were commemorated. Most of the photographers were conveniently located downtown. And before we leave, let's experience nights out in New Orleans in 1964 and then 10 years later. On the cover of This Week in New Orleans is City Park's Storyland, thankfully still a vibrant attraction today. The movie It's a Mad, 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 Mad World was playing at the Martin Cinerama on Tulane Avenue. And for a slice of history, there was the Musée Conti, a wax museum in the French Quarter that featured some of the city's historical figures. Buck 49 had a stake with that incredible price at their locations on Airline Highway and Bourbon Street. Beloved clarinetist Pete Fountain had his own club on Bourbon for many years, and just a few blocks away was Tony's Pizza and Spaghetti House. If you wanted to imagine yourself in an exotic locale, there was the Bally High restaurant at Pontchartrain Beach. The Bally High's decor evoked a Polynesian paradise. And why not take a harbor tour on the steamer President, an Art Deco masterpiece that often featured local jazz bands. What would have been some choices for a night on the town in 1974? Thanks to a copy of the Today in New Orleans Tourist Guide, we can see that the options were many. There was T. Metairie's restaurant, famous for wild game and lobster dishes, including one called Lobster Cadobster, a mix of seafood. Another possibility was Cobb's, with an old Bavaria setting and a menu of German and American cuisine. Incredibly, the price of a 4-course dinner there, $5.50. Over at the Fairmont, now Roosevelt Hotel, singer Edie Adams was the headliner at the famed Blue Room Supper Club. Chris Owens, known for her spirited Latin dancing, did 3 shows on weeknights, and on Friday and Saturday, a show at 2 a.m. from her Bourbon Street nightclub. Also on Bourbon was the Stage Door Canteen, open until 4 a.m. A live big band played swing music from the 1940s. The Metairie entertainment district, known of as Fat City, boasted numerous restaurants and nightclubs. There was Glenn's, and still with us, Drago's, with oysters on the half shell and much more. Nightclubs included Sancho Panza and the Spanish Galleon. After dinner and dancing or a show, an evening in Fat City could conclude with coffee and beignets, or donuts, as locals call them, at the Morning Call, which had recently moved from the French Quarter. By the way, Morning Call has since returned to New Orleans. Memories of Christmas in New Orleans in the 1950s and 60s would most certainly include downtown Canal Street. Of course, getting your picture taken with Santa was a must. This is little me. I guess I was mesmerized by being in the presence of such a celebrity. At the top of Monica Barthé Turner's photo with Santa, you can actually see a Mr. Bingle doll, which means that this photo was taken at Maison Blanche department store. Bingle's initials were MB, the same as the store name. He was a mascot for the popular retail establishment. Bingle still exists today thanks to Dillard's. D.H. Holmes department store was another must-visit along Canal Street, with its elaborate holiday windows. Further down the street was the magnificent home of the Santani family. From the mid-40s until the mid-60s, Mrs. Myra Collins Santani and her husband Sal created a winter wonderland. The Santanis even inspired a young Al Copeland, founder of Popeye's famous fried chicken, who would go on to lavishly decorate his own home for Christmas. Thanks for reminiscing, and let's all strive for a future that creates great memories for everyone.